We're going to start on the far side with Loan Ung, who we're absolutely thrilled to have here at USIP today, I think for the first time. She is a best-selling author, public speaker, activist, and co-screenplay writer of First They Killed My Father, a critically acclaimed 2017 movie directed with Angelina Jolie, based on her memoir that is streaming on Netflix. Loan started her activism work in 1993 as the community educator for a domestic shelter in the state of Maine. And since then, she's worked on various campaigns to end violence against women and the use of child soldiers, eradicate landmines globally. In 1995, Loan made her first trip back to Cambodia, and she's returned over 40 times since, really devoting herself to helping her native land heal from the traumas of war. In addition to her best-selling book, First They Killed My Father, Loan is also the author of Lucky Child and Lulu in the Sky, and a contributor writer on the film Girl Rising, directed by the award-winning director Richard Robbins. And I'd just say on a personal note, I would never forget, and I think anybody who's ever read her book would never forget reading her book. And for me, it was, as a recent college graduate, traipsing around Southeast Asia, reading everything I could about the region, and her book was one that I can never forget. I'm afraid, though, I probably read a copy that did not get a royalty back to you, as is the case for many. But Loan, let's start with you and with some initial thoughts, and then I'll introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's very wonderful to be here with you all. And Tim, I see you. For many of us, all roads in this room and outside out there, all roads lead to Tim Reeser and Patrick Leahy. And that was mine as well. So Tim, thank you so much for encouraging me to write my book many, many years ago, and send it to Patrick Leahy, my personal hero. And so it's wonderful to be here. When I was asked, or Andrew wrote me and said, you've got 10 minutes to share your thoughts about healing from the wounds of war. That's like asking somebody to look in the sky and say, you've got 10 minutes to tell me how many stars there are in the sky. Both are impossible to pinpoint. However, I do think there are some components that are perhaps universal in the issue of healings from the wounds of war. As a Buddhist, we believe that healing really entails doing the work for body, mind, and spirit. As a writer, I also think that there are components to healings that we should all address, especially when we're talking about healings from the wounds of war. And these are multi-pronged, multi-layers, levels or components to healings that serve as a constellation of guiding lights toward the path. And in order to even think about healing, we have to address first the personal, individual healing, as well as the national level of healing, and also our global responsibility and our global work that we all need to do to address the long tails of war. And so the national healing for me, and of course in 10 minutes, I will just briefly give my thoughts on some of what I think we need to look at. On the national level, from 1975 to 1979, Cambodia as a country suffered a collective trauma. Trauma that did not happen to 1 or 3 or 4 of us, but trauma that happened to all 7 million of us in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma. Trauma that happened when the Khmer Rouge came into our country on April 17, 1975, and in the span of 3 years, 8 months, and 21 days, went on and enacted the Marxist-Leninist policy to create a new utopian agrarian society in which money and wealth were abolished, power was taken from the poor and the workers of the country and given to the elites and the true revolutionaries. I'm assuming all of us here know a little bit of Cambodia, so I won't go into that politics. But as a survivor, it was trauma that forced us to live in fear for the next 4 years of our lives, in which our rights, one by one, were taken from us. First, the soldiers came into my country, and then they pulled out their bullhorns and they started screaming to all of us in the city to leave our homes. And if we did not leave, the Americans and their B-52 metal killing birds would come into the nation, bomb our skies and our land, and we would all be killed. And then we were forced to live in villages for the next 4 years that were more akin to labor camps, and in which every day was a Monday, and every Monday a work day. And it didn't matter if you were 6 or 60. You dug trenches, you built dams, you grew food, that then the trucks came in and took the food away, came back with guns and arms to support a war you didn't vote for, you didn't want, you didn't understand, but you had no voice. That was the trauma. You could not speak up. Anybody and everybody who refused and disagreed with the Khmer's communist policies were viewed as enemies of the state. And the solution for these enemies of the state was to purge or crush them. So while we lived in fear and starved one by one, the soldiers came and collected the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the dancers, and had them executed en masse. And still, in a place like that, everywhere they looked, they saw more enemies, more traitors. So they sent out more soldiers. And this time they collected the daughters and the sons and the fathers and the mothers of the people they killed, and they had them executed. That was my trauma. Cambodia as a country went through this collective trauma together. By the end of the Khmer's regime on January 7, 1979, when I was 9 years old, an estimated of 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians would perish from starvation, disease, hard labor, execution, out of a population of 7 million people. Over a quarter of the country's population. Among the victims were both my parents, 2 sisters, and 20 other relatives. And so I'm very passionate and have been following the tribunal that had been established, and long history and complicated history that started in 1997 when the 2 prime ministers went and asked the UN to help create a hybrid tribunal, or a tribunal that eventually, after 10 years of negotiation, became a hybrid Cambodian UN tribunal to put on trials key leaders of the Khmer's for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This past September 22nd, the tribunal officially closed after having spent 16 years and $337 million to convict all of 3 old men. There were observers who were critical of the tribunal itself. Completely, yes, a very flawed system. $370 million to convict 3 old men. I might have agreed with that had I not been a survivor. I might have believed that that was money not well spent had I not been a survivor. As a survivor, the numbers that matter more to me are 2 million of 7 million people, 2 parents, 2 sisters, 20 relatives, and the 5 million survivors who know very little of what happened to their family members. As a survivor, what the tribunal did was to push to gather information that we did not know exist, that we did not know where to find. And it was the funding and the push to start, and led by DC CAM, the Cambodian Documentation Center, and their team of researchers that went out to the 35 provinces in Cambodia to gather multiple millions of documents that are now gathered in a centralized location. So that we now, if we need to know, when we're ready to know, can find this information. And also the push of work to map out 20,000 mass graves in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma. Mass graves that once Cambodian kids thought were merely perhaps bomb shelters or craters or ponds that turn out to house and turn out to be the graves of over 1 million skulls of somebody's loved ones. Majority of them were not killed with bullets, but blunt instruments to the back of their heads. So as a country, Cambodia needed this tribunal for more than anything, I think, for the residual, for the information gather, and for the education for the descendants of all the people killed and for the people who survived. So that for me is briefly the national level. The individual level, this is something I know well through my writing and through my work, and it was why I went to Cambodia for that first time in 1995, and why I've been back to Cambodia on over 40 trips, and why I keep going and keep telling the story of Cambodia. Healing from the wounds of war requires that we also heal ourselves, because are we not part of this world? Are we not, all 8 billion of us, part of this world? And we are to heal on this greater issue. We also have to look at our own individual personal story. For Americans and for my friends, my story is very unimaginable. For the Cambodians I know, my story is not unique. For the 100, 120, or 160 million people in our world who have gone through wars, my story is not unique. I have friends who were once one of 8 and are now the only survivor. I have friends who are like me when they go back to Cambodia and they look at that sunset. It is not beauty they see, but horrors and hell. I have haunted nightmares in Cambodia that have taken me many years to create new memories to overshadow or at least fade the memories of the war. Of the last sunset I remember being aware of in Cambodia when the soldiers came for my father. And as they walked my father off with guns on their back into the sunset, and I looked at that sky, and the gods that night had painted this palette of gold, magenta, red, and pink, shimmering in its multiple divine colors. All I felt was hate in my heart. And all I asked was, why did the world not see this? How was it possible that people in other parts of the world were seeing this beautiful sunset when I only saw hell? How was it possible, but when I looked at that sun, I wished for it to be a weapon that would explode and take me out and take all of us out? There was rage, there was hurt, and that was kind of memories that would take me many decades to build upon. For the truth is too hard to bear. That in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma, we have over 20,000 mass graves. Majority of them were killed with blunt instruments to the back of their heads, smashed to the back of their heads. For my friends and I, who are Cambodians, our wish today and our wish then when I was 9 years old continue to be that I hope and pray the soldiers use one of their bullets to end my father's life, to make his death quick and painless. What do other children in the world prayed for when they were 7? What do they wish for their children? I am heartened and happy to say that in 1975, Cambodia had all of 2 psychiatrists. In a country that was Buddhist in nature, we believe in astrology and animism and luck, that we now have 60 psychiatrists, and that the destigmatization of mental issues and mental illness is now much more accepted. 60 psychiatrists for 16 million people. Imagine that. I am heartened that still it is shifting and it is changing, because when you listen to Cambodia, we don't talk about the wars, we don't talk about the horrors, but we will tell you ghost stories and being possessed and a monster coming in. But if you listen closely, you hear residual talks of what these possessions, what they look like, what they did. And lastly, very briefly, our global healing, what we need to do and what we need to admit to ourselves and each other. When I came to America and I went to school and I studied Russian history, American history, Vietnamese history even, there was perhaps one whole sentence on Cambodia. And it enraged me and it confused me. For how is it possible that we don't talk about Cambodia, that we don't know Cambodia, when in fact, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge might have not happened had the US war not moved over to Cambodia. And the bombings bombed Cambodia and dropped 500,000 tons of bombs onto a neutral country at that time. And it succeeded in killing anywhere between 150 to 200,000 Cambodians and destabilized the land, pushing the farmers off, moving them into the city where there was no food, no shelters, no safety. And then opening up the borders. There's lots of discussions on how Sihanouk, the ruling of the time, was ousted from power. But we do know Lon Nol, his replacement, opened the war, brought in the US, and then the war full-fledged came to Cambodia. And when the US left Vietnam and left Cambodia, the Khmers went from a couple of thousand ragtag guerrilla troops in the jungle to many thousands taking over the country. How is it that in my class I never heard of Cambodia? And in college I had to go and buy my own books about Cambodia. And that Cambodia somehow is never a part of Vietnam legacy. That should not be. We in this global world, to talk about global healing, has to address the long tails of war, and that wars do not stay within borders, especially when the borders was broken open when wars went into our country. But wars ricochet in its tails, does not end when guns fall silent, and does not stay when we are so intertwined and move about. I know I'm coming upon my time. What gives me hope is that we are telling our own stories. That our Cambodians are telling it as dancers, as musicians, as writers, as activists, as policymakers. What gives me hope on the talk Healings from the Wound of Wars is that the heart, our human heart, is the most vital organ in the human body. And for as many times as it breaks, with assistance, with education, with awareness, it has the ability and capability to heal.
Thank you, Long. Powerful and inspiring. But time is short, so we will move on to our next speaker to make sure we have a little bit of time. Once again, Andrew Wells-Dong will be collecting questions online and in person. So if you have one in person, please note it down on a piece of paper. Our last speaker is going to be Sarah Gulabdura, who serves as Executive Director of Legacies of War. It's the only international U.S.-based advocacy and educational organization working to address the impacts of the American Secret War in Laos and conflict in neighboring countries of Cambodia and Vietnam during the Vietnam War era, including the removal of unexploded ordnance and victor and survival assistance. Before taking on this new role, Sarah was a longtime volunteer and served on Legacies board for 5 years, so she was the perfect person to take over. And under her leadership, U.S. funding for UXO clearance in Laos has reached $45 million, the largest level in history.
Tom.
I'll also say that if anybody has run into Sarah, you'll know that she's been working with some key members of Congress to really scale this assistance in by considerable orders of magnitude. So over to you, Sarah. We'd love to hear about your work and how we should think about Laos in this story.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And thank you so much to USIP for inviting me to be a part of today's very, very important discussion. Thanks especially to my friend Andrew for the invitation and Ginny for all her coordination. I don't know where she is. But it's such an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I see so many friends in the audience, and I know many tuning in online. So I was actually born and raised in Laos up to the age of 6 years old. Most of my memories, childhood memories, are very, very fun and beautiful ones. One in particular, I remember running in the grounds of the ancient Wat Pu in the southern part. It was my favorite thing to chase the cats, goats, and the notorious monkeys. Every time I think about these wonderful childhood memories of growing up, in Laos, darker memories would creep in, to my thoughts. You see, my father was a surgeon, and he worked on countless victims of UXO accidents or unexploded ordnance. And many of these victims that he worked in numerous villages were around the same age as my siblings and I. And I would never forget the blood and their cries when my father had to do emergency surgery on them. During that time, 1990, when I was 6 years old, there was no professional demining organization working in Laos. And my parents just saw a very, very bleak and just dangerous future for their children. So we ended up fleeing to the United States. And we landed right here in our nation's capital. I remember it being a cold day. And for the first time in my life, I was riding in a fast-moving car, huge highway, passing countless majestic monuments, the White House, the Pentagon. As a child, I was in awe, and I was wonderstruck by all of these images. I still am today. But back then, as a 6-year-old, I had no idea the connection and the deep history between the United States, my new home, and my birthplace of Laos. I had no idea that from 1964 to 1973, the US dropped over 2.5 million tons of ordnance during 580,000 bombing mission over Laos. That's equivalent to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 straight years, earning Laos the unwanted title of being the most bombed country per capita in history. Over 700,000 people were killed, maimed, or became refugees, like my own family, who had to flee. If that wasn't enough suffering, 30% of these bombs failed to detonate on impact, leaving millions of cluster bombs the size of a tennis ball scattered all throughout every 18 provinces in Laos. And of these 18 provinces, 50% are considered severely contaminated, meaning farmers can't till their land. This hinders progress. This hinders a child from walking to school in safety, roads building. It hinders literally all aspects of Laos life, of life in Laos. Since the war has ended, about 25,000 people, at least 25,000 people, are still being injured or killed by these unexploded ordnance. 40% of the victims are children, meaning those under the age of 18. You know, today, as a Lao American, I'm proud to represent Legacies of War as the new director. Because the good news is, you know, there is a solution to this problem. And if we work together, we can rid Laos of these unexploded ordnance. And Legacies exists because this is a contemporary issue, and it's a humanitarian issue, and it deserves our attention, constant attention. While the war has been over for nearly 50 years, people's lives are still impacted today. And Legacies address this problem in 3 different ways. The first is our grassroots advocacy efforts that Brian mentioned. The second is our educational work. The third is building the next pipeline of leaders to carry forth the torch, because I plan to retire one day. So let me talk to you about our advocacy effort. You know, Legacies of War is the leading voice in terms of pushing for increased funding for Laos since our founding in 2004. So back in those days, funding was a little under $3 million to today, $45 million that Brian shared, the highest funding level in history. And funding increases makes a huge impact. In 2004, the number of deaths and injuries was around 300 per year. Fast forward to the past 3 years, under 50. Under 50. That's a huge progress. And there's still more work to be done, which is why we will continue to work with congressional champions like Senator Leahy and Tim Reeser and others to make sure that funding for Laos continue to increase. Second, I also, believe that our country can do a lot more than just funding, because cluster bombs, landmines are indiscriminate weapons. They can't tell the difference between a child or a combatant. So we need to join in with other NATO members and ban these weapons. I hope that in the next 2 years or so, Congress and President Biden will accede to the Mine Ban Treaty as well as the Convention on Cluster Munition, taking a stance that the U.S. is a leader in humanitarian issue, that we will join the 100 other countries that have already acceded to these 2 international treaties. The second piece of our work, I love what you said about not learning, though I don't love that you didn't learn about Cambodian history. But while the American Secret War is a part of American history, it is not taught in American schools. So Legacies of War address this in several different ways. The first one is our podcast, which I hope you all will tune in. The executive producer of this is in this room, Alina Intali. This is very short, 15 to 20 minutes interviews with demining partners like mine advisory groups, as well as survivors, as well as environmental experts, talking about the importance of mine action work in very short, simple to listen to clips. The second is one that I'm particularly very proud of. We call this the Legacies Library. And this is a repository of information all related to the American Secret War in the forms of documentaries, books, articles, and other. And hopefully in the future, when we build greater capacity at Legacies of War, we can also include more on Cambodian history and Vietnam history as well. Our crowning jewel in our Legacies Library, we call them the originals. This is a collection of illustrations and written testimony from survivors and victims of the US bombings themselves. This is the only primary source documentation that exists from survivors from this time period. And we have this housed at Legacies of War. I just want to share briefly one of the images, just because, I think like many of you, I've been following the war in Ukraine. And this one, you know exactly why I chose it. But this is an image of a burning school building with fires all around it. And the caption that's on this particular illustration reads, "The school was hit and burned. There were many people in the school who died. But I didn't know who because I wasn't courageous enough to look. I was afraid that the airplanes would shoot me." That's written by a 16-year-old child watching his school burn. So we preserve these for future generation. And all of the educational content that Legacies of War has is free of charge, because we believe that everyone should know about this history, especially Americans. History, storytelling has a way of healing, has a way of allowing victims and survivors to reclaim that narrative, and it's also a form of justice. The very final piece of our work that I want to highlight is our investment in the next generation of young leaders who want to take mine action, who want to continue to preserve and share this history, who also are doing amazing things interning at Legacies of War. We partner with a variety of different universities all across the United States, one of which my dear friend Paul from the University of Dayton Human Rights Center has an intern with Legacies. And this year, I'm particularly proud that we're able to, the first time in history, bring an intern with us on our annual study trip to Laos this year. This is a huge, huge investment in the next generation so that they see firsthand experience of what it's like for deminers to work in the field, to see programs that assist victims and survivors. So I'm really looking forward to the trip this year. In closing, I just want to say that the legacies of war are immeasurable, and the pain spans generations. And there's many, many forms. And healing is slow, but healing is possible with the right actionable. I'm proud of my country, the United States of America, for being the largest single funder globally in demining efforts. The United States invests about 36% of all funding for demining work globally. In Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, since 1993, we invested $657 million. And I hope that members of Congress and leaders will continue to invest in Southeast Asia and grow this pot of funding so we can find those bombs before a child does. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. You know, it's clear that for on the strategic side of things, Congress definitely is increasingly focused on Southeast Asia, but making sure we have a rich, holistic picture of the situation, our history, what it takes to overcome it. What you're doing is just incredibly important on so many dimensions. Andrew, I know we have time for a couple more questions, and I've seen a lot of cards making their way to you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you both for sharing both personally and nationally and globally about the meaning of healing from war. And this comes, I think, to the heart of USIP's mission as a peace-building organization. USIP works both in countries that are affected by conflict and coming out of conflict, and also in the US on peace education. And we have one question from the audience, that both of you were discussing the lack of coverage of Laos and Cambodia in US schools. What can educators do to make students more aware and to take action about healing from war? Maybe Lo first.
They can teach my book. That would be really helpful. I mean, thankfully a lot of them are teaching my books in different university, colleges, and high school. But you know, I do think also that I always say to students, if you have 5 minutes, listen to NPR. You know, listen to actual real news. And then if you have 11 minutes, listen to Morning Edition. But we need to really get our students to pay attention to real news. And you know, my books, or Ishmael Bay, or Big Toronto Bivang, many where stories are, where stories have real relevance to human life, to human beings, and not just snippets and not just sound bites. And I really do think it is so important that we teach young people just the importance of learning real news, relevant news, truthful news, as opposed to social media news. And because everything starts with an education, and everything starts with knowing what is true and what is false. And so for me, there's just really starts with education.
Yeah, one resource that I would recommend is Legacies Library. It's a free online legasiesofwar.org that teachers, professors can access. But I think the main issue here is that it's systematic, right? Like, this isn't taught. I mean, I went to school here in the US, and we maybe spent a day, if not, if a day and a half on the Vietnam War, and Laos was a footnote if we were lucky. but it's educators not knowing themselves sometimes, right? So we can't blame them. But having broader outreach, organizations doing the work like ourselves, and teachers having that interest to make outreach to find curriculum that we have, free of charge. But I would encourage people to talk to one another about what you learn, or what you know, and encourage people to talk to their members of Congress, and to get this into the school system.
I mean, and certainly the political legacy of the Vietnam War in the United States is very complicated. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and hopefully with some more distance we can teach the war, understand the war in a more sophisticated way. And I think part of doing that is thinking broader and geographically as well. So hopefully there could be opportunities.
Yeah. I'll add one last piece to this, is that the war has impacted many, many different segments of Americans, as well as 1.5 generations like myself. Being able to bravely tell the stories like you, right, from a personal perspective, is powerful, and it also allows people to hear from someone who has that lived experience. But there are many others. I'll just kind of share. One of our amazing board members, Jessica Pierce-Rotundi, wrote a book, What We Inherit. And this is about finding the place where her uncle's plane crashed in Laos, right? That is a whole different segment of the American public that has been touched by this secret war. So more people need to write, right?
And I also just think what happened in Cambodia, right, bake, dance, whatever it is that is your expression, just to tell your story. But I also think it's so important for us, one, we need to learn about Cambodia and Laos and its connection to the global world, but also that what happened in Cambodia did not happen in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. What happened in Cambodia did not just happen to Cambodians. The Khmer Rouge killed 1.72 million people. Those were crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, not only crimes against Cambodians. Those were crimes against all 8 billion of us. And therefore we need to know, because this whole history, human history of never again since World War II, never again has become again and again and again in Bosnia and Cambodia and Rwanda. And if we don't learn our whole history, if we don't learn our complete history, we will keep on making and repeating the same darn mistakes. And really, we can do better than that. We are humanities. We are human beings. We have free will. We have potentials. We can send people to, again, now to the moon for however many times. We are it. Until we can leave this and go to Mars and colonize there, this is it. And so we have to learn our global history, because what happens in Cambodia is not that far to what happened here. And really, is it that unimaginable when we read about Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, of young people who strap on weapons we're seeing it in America, all the violence taking place here. When you were raised in hate, and you are encouraged to live in hate, and you are breed to think hate 24/7 on a daily basis, as a former child soldier. When my parents were killed and the soldier put guns half my body's weight, a third my body's height, and told me to hurt, and told me if I didn't hurt you first, you would hurt me, I have no doubt if the war hadn't ended, I would have been a very efficient soldier. But I am actually an activist for peace, because people stepped out of their ways, lent us a helping hand, and helped me to not only survive the war, but to thrive in peace. And that is our work. To create peace, we have to help people get hate out of them, heal their heart, and thrive in peace. And we can do that. We can do so much. And I absolutely, this is why I'm so optimistic. I know we can do it. We can do it because it happened to me. I was the most hateful little kid you could have met when I was young. And I would have no doubt, small, but I could probably take a lot of people out. At least I believe that. I probably could. But you know, I'm choosing to use my voice differently because I was taught and shown by Patrick Leahy, by Tim Reeser, by Bobby Mueller, by Andrew, to do things differently, to create peace and not fight war.
Long, Sarah, we're honored that you're able to join us. We thank you for taking the time. I think we've had an incredible kickoff to our 2 days here, a diversity of views of which is flashback and topics of which is flashback 45 minutes ago when Michael, Jed, and Ambassador Nin were sitting up here. So please join me in thanking our 2 panelists again. Reminder, we'll be online tomorrow morning as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.